The radiation alarm screams first. Then the windshield of the lead humanitarian truck explodes inward. Safety glass, blood, silence. Sergeant Maya Carter doesn't move. She's already behind her rifle, already scanning. The round came from the east. Elevation advantage. Cooling tower cluster, maybe 800 meters out. But that's not what stops her breathing. Her radio crackles. One burst, encrypted, wrong frequency. Someone just radioed her exact position before that shot. She sweeps her scope back toward the towers. Movement. Deliberate. Patient. Not a spotter, not a scout. A sniper. Already watching her. Already waiting. The Geiger counter on her wrist ticks faster. So does her pulse. The helicopter banked hard left, and Maya Carter felt the desert rise up to meet them. Below, the exclusion zone stretched in every direction. 23 square miles of scorched nothing. Cracked roads, collapsed fencing, warning signs in 3 languages, all of them faded to the same bleached yellow. The kind of yellow that meant, stay out even if you couldn't read. She could read them fine. She chose to ignore them anyway. 2 minutes, the crew chief called over the intercom. Maya checked her gear for the 4th time. Not from anxiety, from discipline. Scope caps secure, suppressor torqued, MOPP suit sealed at the wrists. The suit was rated for low-level radiological environments. Whether this environment qualified as low-level was a question she'd stopped asking 2 briefings ago. The facility below had a formal designation. Nevada Advanced Materials Research Station, NAMRS-7. The briefing packet called it decommissioned. The Geiger counter clipped to her chest rig called it something else. It had been clicking steadily since they crossed the perimeter fence at 40,000 feet. 30 seconds. She moved to the door. The crew chief grabbed her arm. Young kid, maybe 22, with the wide eyes of someone who hadn't fully processed where they were. Ma'am, they said the background radiation out there is... I know what it is. They said prolonged exposure past 6 hours could... I know. She met his eyes, held them. I'll be back in 5. She jumped before he could find another reason to worry about her. The LZ was a collapsed parking structure on the facility's eastern perimeter. She landed on the 3rd level, rolled, came up clean. The helicopter was already pulling away, rotors thinning to nothing within seconds. Good crew. Fast insertion. No one loitering over a hot zone. She moved immediately. The apartment tower she'd selected from satellite imagery was 300 meters north, a 14-story residential block that had housed facility workers before the evacuation. Most windows still intact on the upper floors. Good masonry. Enough structural integrity for a sniper hide if you picked the right room and didn't trust the stairwell above the 8th floor. She trusted nothing above the 7th. The streets were wrong in the way that only truly abandoned places become wrong. Not bombed out wrong, not war wrong. Something quieter and more permanent. A bicycle leaned against a lamppost with flat tires that had simply deflated over years. A child's shoe in the middle of the road. No pair, no explanation. A supermarket with the front windows intact, but every shelf inside bare. Swept clean by whoever had organized the evacuation with enough time to be methodical about it. The Geiger counter ticked. Wind moved through broken gutters. Nothing else moved. She reached the tower, cleared the lobby, took the stairs 2 at a time. 7th floor, northeast corner, room 714. The window had been blown out at some point, frame intact, glass long gone. She didn't mind. Glass created reflection problems. Open frames did not. She set up in the shadows, 3 feet back from the opening, the way Callahan had taught her. Never at the window, never silhouetted. The window is a frame, not a position. She arranged a broken dresser as a shooting platform, low profile, stable enough, and settled behind the Schmidt and Bender scope. The exclusion zone spread out below her in high definition. To the north, the main research facility. 3 main buildings connected by covered walkways, surrounded by a secondary fence that had partially collapsed on the western side. The cooling towers, 2 of them, massive concrete cylinders, rose above everything else, their tops ragged where age and mild seismic activity had crumbled the upper lips. To the south, the access road. 2 lanes cracked down the center. This was the route the convoy would take. To the east, open desert, scrub brush, a dry riverbed, and beyond that, the secondary cluster of facility outbuildings, maintenance sheds, transformer stations, a water treatment structure. She noted the angles, noted the distances, committed the rangefinder numbers to memory. 840 to the facility gate, 620 to the access road midpoint, 1150 to the far cooling tower. She noted the wind, coming out of the west at roughly 12 knots, gusting to 18. The radioactive particulate in the air would affect ballistics at range. Not dramatically, but enough to matter at the outer numbers. She noted all of it. Then she settled in to wait. The radio crackled to life at 0630. Overwatch, this is Control. You on station? Jack Callahan's voice. Flat, unhurried, with the particular texture of a man who had spent too many years in too many bad places to get excited about one more. She'd worked with him for 14 months. She'd heard that voice in sandstorms, during firefights, once during a mortar barrage that had collapsed half the building he was calling from. It never changed pitch. On station, she said, 714, northeast corner, clean sight lines south and east, cooling towers in range. Good. Satellite feed is marginal. Something in the particulate is bouncing the signal. I've got you as a blue dot, but the convoy tracking is intermittent. Stay eyes on. Copy. Brief me. A pause. She could hear him pulling up something on his end. UN contracted humanitarian convoy. 6 vehicles. Lead truck carries medicine, antibiotics, antivirals, radiation sickness treatment. Second and third are food and water. 4 and 5 are personnel carriers, medics, 2 civilian aid workers, UN observer. 6 is a security vehicle, 3-man team, private contractor. Who contracted them? UN hired through DynCorp subsidiary, background checked, cleared. She filed that away without comment. Civilians on the route? According to the last census before evacuation, none. Zone was declared uninhabitable after the 2019 reactor event. Full relocation was completed within 90 days. Another pause. According to the census. She understood the emphasis. Rules of engagement? Defensive only. You do not engage unless the convoy is directly threatened. You do not engage local civilians under any circumstances. You do not engage unless you have confirmed hostile intent and no alternative. And if I have all 3, then you do what you were trained to do. A brief pause that might have been a sigh. But Maya, this is not a kill mission. This is Overwatch. The convoy goes in, delivers the aid, comes back out. Clean, simple. That's the entire mission. Nothing about this zone is clean. No, Callahan agreed. It is not. The radio went quiet. She watched the access road. At 7:12, the first vehicle appeared on the southern horizon. The convoy moved slowly, appropriately slowly. The road surface was unreliable and the lead driver was being careful. Maya tracked it through her scope, methodically scanning from vehicle to vehicle, back to the perimeter, back to the convoy. The rhythm of Overwatch, constant, patient, never resting on one point too long. The lead truck was exactly as briefed. UN markings on the doors, windshield intact, driver and passenger visible, both in civilian clothes, both wearing respiratory protection. Professional, cautious. Something else was also moving. At the edge of the exclusion zone's eastern sector, where the dry riverbed curved toward the facility's secondary entrance, she picked up figures. civilian dress, moving in a loose group, following a path that roughly paralleled the convoy's approach without intersecting it. She counted 8, then 12, then more emerging from the ruins of what the map labeled as a maintenance outbuilding. Civilians, moving toward the facility, not away from it. She keyed the radio. "Control, I have civilian movement. Eastern Sector, Grid 447. Approximately 20 individuals moving north toward the facility's secondary entrance. Not on any map I was given." Callahan's response was a beat slower than usual. "Copy that. Can you characterize? Age range? Movement pattern?" She watched. 2 elderly individuals moving with assistance. Several who looked to be working age. And, she adjusted focus, children. At least 4. "Mixed demographics," she said. "Elderly, adults, children, moving in family groups. Not tactical movement. They look like they know where they're going." "People who stayed," Callahan said quietly. "They're not in the census because they never registered for relocation." "How do you survive in a hot zone for 5 years?" "Parts of the zone have lower background readings. If you know which buildings to shelter in, which water sources aren't contaminated," he stopped, "or if someone's been supplying them." She swept back to the convoy, then back to the civilians. The groups were not interacting, but their paths were converging on the same point. The facility's eastern wing, which her maps showed as administrative offices, structural status unknown. "Someone planned this," she said. "The aid drop location was specified in the mission orders," Callahan said. "Facility courtyard, eastern wing entrance. I assumed it was for vehicle access." A pause. "These people have been waiting for this convoy. They knew it was coming." "Yes." She lowered the scope for a moment, looked at the zone with her naked eye. Bare concrete and dead scrub in the slow gray light of morning over the desert. "Someone also knew we were coming," she said. Callahan didn't answer immediately. "What makes you say that?" "Because whoever left those people here also chose not to warn them. If this zone is under observation, which it clearly is, then whoever owns that observation capability knows a humanitarian convoy just entered, and they haven't done anything." She paused. "Yet." Another silence. "Stay sharp," Callahan said. The convoy reached the facility courtyard at 0834. Maya had repositioned. The original hide in 714 gave her good coverage of the access road, but a compromised angle on the eastern wing entrance. She'd moved to 809, 1 floor up, 2 rooms west, accepting the slightly longer exposure during the move in exchange for clean sightlines to the courtyard. The Geiger counter ticked higher here. Room 809 had a crack in the exterior wall that ran floor to ceiling, and the accumulated dust in the crack registered noticeably above background. She stayed away from the crack, kept her movements deliberate. The civilians emerged from the eastern wing entrance to meet the convoy. Someone had clearly organized them. They moved in an orderly line, not a rush. Medical cases first. Children. Elderly. The aid workers stepped down from the trucks and began working immediately, professional and efficient. It was, for approximately 4 minutes, exactly what it was supposed to be. Then the shot came. She heard it before she processed it. The crack of a high-powered rifle, suppressed but not silent, coming from the northeast. The round hit the hood of the lead truck. Not the windshield, not the driver, the hood. Warning shot, or a miss. She was already behind the scope. Northeast. Cooling tower cluster. She swept the upper edges. Damaged concrete, shadow and light, nothing. There. A muzzle flash reflection off what might have been a scope lens. Upper edge of the western cooling tower, maybe 900 meters. The reflection was there for less than a second. "Shooter northeast," she reported. "Western cooling tower, approximate position upper rim. 900, single round." "Convoy's stopping," Callahan said. She could hear the urgency creeping into his flat voice. "Convoy leader is on his radio. Tell him to get his vehicles moving to the eastern wing wall. Hard cover, Do it now. A second round hit, this time the access road surface, 20 meters behind the rear vehicle. Still not a direct hit. Still not killing anyone. Testing us, she thought. Not shooting to kill, shooting to map our response. She did not fire. She held the position, breathed, watched the cooling tower. Nothing moved. Control, I have no confirmed target. Shots appear to be probing, mapping our reaction. I am holding fire. Copy. Convoy is moving to the wall. Aid workers are down. Civilians are back inside. A pause. Maya, who fires warning shots with a suppressed long rifle? She already knew the answer. Someone who doesn't want to attract attention to the fact that they're here. Someone for whom the suppressor is standard, not exceptional. Someone professional. Not insurgents, she said. No, Callahan agreed, not insurgents. The radio interference began at 0902. It didn't cut out. That would have been simpler. It degraded. Callahan's voice became layered with a low harmonic buzz, a frequency interference pattern that Maya recognized from signals intelligence training. Not atmospheric, not equipment failure, active jamming. She keyed the radio twice, the signal check protocol. One click back. Callahan had heard her. But when he spoke again, his words were fragmented, arriving in 2-second blocks with gaps between them that swallowed entire sentences. SATL feed is, can't hold the, they're running, on grid 44. Then static. She waited, keyed again. Nothing but the carrier tone and the hiss. She checked her backup comms, the emergency satellite phone clipped to her left shoulder. Powered on, searching for signal. The icon spun for 30 seconds, then displayed a single word. No network. She looked at the Geiger counter. It had climbed another 4 counts per minute since she'd entered room 809. She was alone in a radioactive exclusion zone with an active sniper at unknown position, a humanitarian convoy pinned against a wall, and no communication with anyone outside the perimeter. She ran through her assets. 1 rifle, 300 rounds, sidearm, 4 days of water, MOPP suit, rangefinder, and 14 months of training under the most paranoid, most experienced counter-sniper instructor the Marine Corps had ever produced. She worked with what she had. She returned to the scope. The thermal monocular showed them at 1017. She'd been scanning the facility systematically, not hoping for the sniper, who would be too well disciplined to show in thermals from this range, but cataloging the environment. Any movement, any heat signature that didn't belong. The group near the main facility entrance did not belong. 6 individuals, moving in 2-man pairs, leapfrogging forward in a tactical bounding pattern that required training and practice to execute cleanly. They wore full protective gear, not MOPP suits, but something higher grade, the kind of whole-body ensemble that ran north of $8,000 per unit. They carried weapons she couldn't identify at this range, but the profile was wrong for military standard rifles. Too compact, too customized. They moved with a kind of quiet efficiency that told her everything she needed to know about their background. These were not soldiers. Soldiers moved with a specific cadence of institutional training. There was a sameness to it, a recognizable rhythm beaten into every service member by the same doctrine. These individuals moved differently. Each one had their own variation, their own personal modifications to the standard pattern. Private, high-end, individual. She'd seen that movement signature before, in contractors operating in Syria and Iraq, the ones who didn't advertise their employer and whose equipment had no visible markings. They were heading for the facility's main entrance, the door that led, according to her building plans, to the primary research wing. Not toward the convoy, not toward the civilians, toward whatever was inside the facility itself. She noted their approach vector, noted their pace, noted the way the point man paused at the facility entrance and ran a handheld device, scanner of some kind, across the door panel before the group entered. They had access codes. She lowered the monocular and stared at the facility building with her naked eye for a long moment. Who gives access codes to a contractor team in a supposedly abandoned, officially sealed research facility? She already knew the answer to that question too. It took her 11 minutes to reconstruct it from the available data points. The civilian population sheltering in the Eastern Wing, the aid convoy routed to this specific location with a specific delivery point, the contractor team with facility access codes, the sniper who fired warning shots rather than killing shots. She ran it again. The convoy wasn't here to deliver aid. The convoy was here because someone needed witnesses present. She thought about it from the other direction. If you wanted to extract sensitive material from a sealed facility without anyone investigating afterward, you needed a cover story. Noise in the system. Activity that could explain vehicle tracks, personnel movement, radio chatter in the exclusion zone. A humanitarian aid delivery provided all of that. The UN observer, the aid workers, the civilian beneficiaries, they were all documentation. They were the explanation that would appear in any after-action report. Humanitarian operation, routine delivery, nothing unusual observed. But the witnesses only worked as cover if they survived to give their statements. The sniper wasn't trying to stop the convoy. The sniper was trying to stop whatever the contractor team was extracting from that facility. And anyone who saw the contractor team, the convoy, the civilians, the Overwatch operator in a 7th-floor hide, was a liability that someone else was going to want removed once the extraction was complete. She felt the cold clarity of it settle into her thinking. She wasn't protecting the convoy from the sniper. She was caught between two competing operations, both of which had reasons to want her dead. She keyed the radio, got static. "Callahan," she said anyway, "I know what this is." Static answered. She turned back to the scope. The cooling towers stood silent against the pale desert sky. Somewhere on one of those towers, a sniper was waiting. She named him Lazarus. Not because she knew his name, she didn't, but because he kept coming back. Every time she was certain she'd mapped his position, he wasn't there. Every time she settled into a read on his behavior, he shifted. Counter-sniper psychology at its most refined. Be the ghost, not the shooter. Make the other person doubt whether you're real at all. She knew he was real. The 2 rounds he'd put near the convoy were real. She studied the cooling towers for 40 minutes without moving. The western tower was the obvious position. Elevated, commanding view of the access road in the courtyard. Obvious positions attracted obvious shooters. Lazarus had used it for the opening shots, which meant either he was average and comfortable with the obvious, or he was good and had already vacated it. She assumed good. The eastern tower was structurally compromised. She could see from here that the upper third had partially sheared away, leaving a jagged concrete shelf about 2/3 up the cylinder. Uncomfortable, unstable, the kind of position that an average shooter avoided. A patient shooter who wanted an unexpected angle would love it. She spent the next 20 minutes on the eastern tower, tracking the shadow patterns across the broken concrete shelf, noting the wind movement in the dust that had accumulated on the exposed rebar. The dust told stories if you knew how to read them. Callahan had spent an entire afternoon in Fallujah teaching her how dust behaved differently when disturbed by footfall versus wind, how the compression pattern changed depending on weight and direction of travel, how you could read a position's occupancy history in particulate the same way a tracker read game trails. She owed Callahan a great deal. There, the dust pattern on the 3rd rebar cluster from the left wasn't moving with the wind. It was displaced. Recent movement had compressed it differently from the surrounding material. Not dramatically, a casual observer would have seen nothing. But she was not a casual observer, and the difference was there if you knew what you were looking for. Someone had been there. Recently enough that the compression hadn't re-randomized. recently enough that they might return. She didn't set up to shoot, she set up to watch. While she watched, she thought about what she knew of the man she was hunting. The suppressed rifle said money. Suppressors of the quality required for that flat, a signature, at 900 meters cost more than most operators' annual salary. Not the cheap commercial units that degraded your barrel and added 6 inches of profile. Something precision machined, purpose-built. The kind of equipment that came from a dedicated armorer rather than a catalog. The contractor team she'd observed entering the facility moved like former Eastern European military, based on the footwork patterns she'd cataloged. The lateral spacing on their bounding overwatch. The way the rear element held its interval with mechanical consistency. Soviet doctrine training, updated for contemporary tactics. If Lazarus came from the same stable, he would have been schooled in the same counter-sniper methodology. Soviet doctrine was old doctrine, but old doctrine that had been refined through actual use in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and a dozen other conflicts that the public record described in sanitized terms. The doctrine emphasized patience over aggression, positional discipline over mobility. You found your position, you committed to it, and you waited for the target to expose themselves through impatience, necessity, or error. What it didn't account for was an opponent who understood the doctrine and was using that understanding against it. He would return to the Eastern Tower. She would be waiting when he did. She shifted slightly to ease the pressure on her left knee, where a fragment of concrete had worked itself under the kneeling pad. She didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on the tower. The Geiger counter ticked. The wind moved through the facility's broken gutters. Far below in the courtyard, the convoy vehicle sat motionless against the eastern wing wall. She could see ahead, the UN observer probably, looking out from the building entrance toward the courtyard, assessing, calculating, doing exactly what she was doing on a different scale. Everyone in this zone was calculating. The only variable was what they were calculating for. The wind shifted at 10:43 and the world turned gray. She'd seen the dust front building on the western horizon for the past hour, a rolling wall of particulate that the desert occasionally produced when thermal differentials created enough pressure variance across the flat terrain. In summer, this zone would generate them regularly, 3 or 4 times a week. The locals, the ones who had lived here before the evacuation, would have known to shelter when the western sky took on that particular flat, yellow-gray tone that preceded a front by 40 minutes. She'd noticed the tone at 10:03. She'd filed it and kept watching the towers. In a normal environment, it would have been a nuisance. Reduced visibility, gritty teeth, the specific irritation of desert dust working into every exposed surface and unsealed opening. She'd operated through worse. This was not a normal environment. The particulate rolling toward her contained everything the exclusion zone had been accumulating for 5 years. Trace radiological material from the 2019 event, chemical residue from decades of materials research, the processed byproducts of whatever work NAMRS-7 had been conducting before the incident. The kind of fine-grained contamination that didn't register dramatically on a Geiger counter because it wasn't concentrating in one place. It was diffuse, suspended, distributed through the air column in quantities that individually meant nothing and collectively meant slow damage over time. Her MOPP suit sealed against it. Mostly. There were limits. The seals at the wrists were rated for 12 hours of continuous exposure before micropermeation became statistically significant. She'd been suited for 4. She had margin. The leading edge of the front hit the tower at 1051. It arrived not as a wall, but as a veil. The air simply thickening, the distance compressing, the sharp edges of the facility and the cooling towers softening, and then disappearing as the particulate density reached the visual interference threshold. Visibility dropped from clear to approximately 400 meters in under 90 seconds. The scope became nearly useless at range. She could see shapes, mass, the suggestion of structures, but no detail. No fine discrimination between shadow and form, between the concealed edge of a human body and the irregular, concrete surface behind it. She cataloged the limitations and adjusted. More significantly, the wind that accompanied the front was variable and powerful. Not the steady crosswind she'd been reading and correcting for since 0630, but a gusting, directionally inconsistent flow that shifted between 12 and 31 knots in cycles she couldn't predict with any confidence. The Coriolis problem she could account for. The humidity differential from the particulate she could model. The spin drift at range was a constant she'd already built into her firing solution. Variable wind at range was not a constant. It was the fundamental, unsolvable problem of long-range shooting. At 1,100 meters, a 31-knot crosswind required a hold correction of nearly 2 full mil-radians. A 12-knot crosswind required half that. If the wind shifted between her trigger brake and the round's arrival at the target, a window of approximately 1.3 seconds at that range, the shot would miss by a margin that made everything else irrelevant. Elevation mastered, spin drift accounted for, wind call wrong, miss. She could not make a reliable shot above 600 meters until the front passed. She ran the math on the front's movement speed. She'd been watching it for an hour. It was moving at roughly the same rate as the wind ahead of it, approximately 15 kilometers per hour. The front was still dense at 6 to 8 kilometers depth, based on the color and density of what she could see on the western horizon before the leading edge arrived. 40 minutes, maybe 45. She checked her watch. She checked the eastern tower, still barely visible through the particulate haze. A dark mass at the edge of perception, undefined. She checked the courtyard where the convoy was still pressed against the eastern wing wall. Still stationary. Aid workers not moving. Waiting out the front like everyone else. 40 minutes was a long time in a situation that was deteriorating. She thought about what Callahan would say. He'd say the same thing he always said when conditions removed her options. You can't shoot through the weather, Carter, so figure out what you can do while you're waiting for it to change. She began building a mental map of every firing position on the rooftop and upper floors she hadn't yet assessed. If the front cleared and Lazarus had used the low-visibility window to relocate, which she would, in his position, she needed solutions that didn't depend on his staying where she thought he was. She worked through the geometry. The Geiger counter ticked higher. She kept working. They came out of the dust at 11:08, 4 of them moving fast from the southeast, using the reduced visibility as cover. Not the same contractor team she'd observed entering the facility. These were different. Lighter equipment, no high-grade protective gear. More aggressive movement pattern, less disciplined spacing. The kind of direct action approach that prioritized speed and shock over tactical sophistication. They were professionals, but a different kind. The contractor team moved like surgeons. These moved like hammers. The distinction mattered. Hammers didn't care about collateral. They opened fire on the convoy vehicles from approximately 200 meters, and they opened fire with a specific intent to suppress rather than immediately eliminate. Long bursts on the vehicles, the ground around them, the building entrance, creating noise in chaos, pinning the convoy personnel, forcing heads down. Maya was already moving. The precision shot envelope she'd been operating in for the past hour was irrelevant now. At 200 meters with a variable wind, she could still achieve reliable center mass hits. The question was positioning. Her current location, room 809, north window, gave her a compromised angle on the southeast approach. The stairwell landing 2 flights down gave her a lower angle shot to the building's exterior opening, sacrificing elevation for a cleaner line into the attack's axis. She moved down the stairwell in 8 seconds, settled into the supported position she'd already mapped. Left arm through the sling, elbow on the broken dresser she'd repositioned there 2 hours ago, precisely because she'd anticipated needing a secondary firing platform at lower elevation. Callahan called this pre-solving, the discipline of thinking through every contingency you could imagine and positioning your assets accordingly so that when the contingency arrived, you were responding from a prepared position rather than improvising from nothing. She'd thought through this contingency. The first target was the one with the light machine gun, a belt-fed, judging by the profile and the sustained rate of fire he was putting on the lead truck. He was setting up a bipod behind a section of collapsed fence, 50 meters from the convoy's rear vehicle, establishing fire superiority before the flanking element moved in. Suppressive fire first, then the sweep. She put the reticle on his upper chest and broke the trigger. The suppressed round made a sound like a staple gun. The target went down hard. The machine gun stopped. Movement to her left. Second shooter, relocating after the first went down. They'd heard nothing, no shot signature, no crack of an unsuppressed round. The first man had simply ceased functioning, and the second man's brain was running through the possibilities. Mechanical malfunction? Friendly fire? Sniper? His pause, the 1.8-second freeze of someone whose situational model had just become invalid, was visible even through the particulate haze. She broke the trigger again. The second man sat down, stayed down. Two left. The remaining pair responded correctly. They separated immediately, the right response to an unseen shooter, because it split the threat and denied a single firing solution. One went hard left behind the convoy vehicles, using the truck bodies as cover. One went hard right, back into the dust toward the southeast. The southeast direction was smart. The dust was still thick enough at that range to provide meaningful concealment. She tracked the right-hand target until the particulate swallowed him. Lost. The left-hand target was a different problem. He was using the convoy vehicles as cover, moving along the line of trucks in a controlled, low crawl toward the eastern wing entrance. Not fleeing, advancing. His objective was the building, the civilians inside. He was between her and the people she was protecting, which meant the trucks were between her bullet and him. She could not take the shot. She tracked his movement through the gaps between trucks. Glimpses of body armor, a partial boot sole, the barrel of his weapon sweeping the entrance as he moved. She had his speed and his heading. She calculated where he would have to appear to complete his approach. Between the second and third vehicles, there was a gap of approximately 90 centimeters. At his current pace, he would pass through that gap in, she counted, 4 seconds. She held on the gap. 3 seconds. 2. The gap was empty. He'd slowed, changed his angle. She swept right. He appeared at the rear bumper of the second truck, standing to make the final move to the entrance, rifle coming up. She broke the trigger. 3. The dust swallowed the fourth. She ran the math. One fled southeast into the particulate. She had no confirmed dead on that one, no confirmed withdrawal. He was either running or he was repositioning. And the difference between those two outcomes had different implications for the next 10 minutes. She swept the area systematically. 4 minutes of disciplined scanning, sector by sector, accepting that in these conditions, 4 minutes was the minimum time required to achieve reasonable confidence in a negative assessment. The firing had stopped. The convoy personnel were alive. The building entrance was clear. She could not confirm the fourth attacker. "Clear for now," she said to no one. "Stay down, stay inside." She was already thinking about where the fourth man had gone and what he'd seen from the southeast approach that might tell Lazarus something about her position. The Geiger counter ticked. The radiation readings were climbing. She'd noted the baseline when she first established position. 0. 3 millisieverts per hour. Elevated above normal background, but within the range the briefing had described as the exclusion zone's operational standard. Uncomfortable for prolonged exposure without protection. Not immediately hazardous for an adult in reasonable health with basic respiratory precautions. By 11:30, it had climbed to zero point 0.7. By noon, it was approaching 1.1. The particulate storm was doing what particulate storms in contaminated environments did, redistributing material that had settled and stabilized over years, suspending it back into the air column and reintroducing it into surfaces and respiratory systems that had achieved a managed equilibrium with the existing contamination levels. The equilibrium was now disrupted. She was protected by the MOPP suit, mostly. The civilians in the Eastern Wing were not in MOPP suits. She didn't know what protection they had. The briefing had not included a detailed assessment of the shelter-in-place population's equipment status, because the briefing had not acknowledged that a shelter-in-place population existed. Their survival over 5 years in this environment suggested they had developed protocols. It didn't tell her what those protocols were or how effective they were against a redistributing storm scenario. She moved to a position where she could observe the Eastern Wing entrance without being visible from the likely positions outside. Through the scope, the outer room was clear, high-ceilinged, institutional, the kind of space that had been designed for function rather than comfort. Fluorescent lights still operational, which meant the building had a functioning power source, which meant someone had been maintaining infrastructure. The civilians were organized in there, not in the random clustering of a frightened group without leadership, in the deliberate arrangement of people who had done this before. Triage area in the near left corner. Children and elderly against the far wall, away from the entrance. Working-age adults in the middle, ready to assist. They'd been preparing for this delivery for a long time. And in the near corner, visible through a gap in the crowd, a child, 8, maybe 9 years old, sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up, the posture of a child who had learned to occupy as little space as possible. She had one of those foil emergency blankets around her shoulders, the kind that came in aid packages, rated for warmth and basic radiation reflection. Someone had given it to her. Her face was turned toward the room, watching the activity with an expression that Maya could only describe as patient. Not frightened, not desperate. Patient in the way that children who have grown up in dangerous places develop a patience that is nothing like the ordinary patience of children who have never needed it. Maya watched her for a moment longer than she should have. She didn't know her name. She didn't need to. The convoy commander appeared at the entrance, heavy-set, mid-40s, with a specific kind of efficiency that came from years of operating in places where deliberate movement meant the difference between coming home and not. He carried a radiation monitor, a more sophisticated unit than Maya's chest-clipped Geiger counter, and he looked at its reading, then at the dust in the air, then at his wounded security man sitting against the wall inside the entrance. He was calculating. She found the convoy commander's channel. It was in her mission briefing, buried in the communications annex, listed as a secondary frequency for coordination in the event of emergency. She keyed it. Convoy lead, this is your overwatch. Stay in position. Attack forces down or withdrawn. You are clear to continue distribution. A pause. His head moved slightly. He was hearing her but scanning for her position. Overwatch, I have a man down. I cannot confirm the perimeter is clear, and my ROE gives me discretionary withdrawal authority under threat conditions. What I'm seeing out here looks like threat conditions. Your discretion, she said, but I'm asking you to use it differently. She paused, choosing the words carefully. Not an order, not a persuasion, just the facts as she knew them. There are 43 people in that building. They've been waiting for what's in your trucks for 5 years. You leave now, they don't get another convoy. Whatever's happening in this facility today is a one-time window, and it is closing. If you're not here when it shuts, the zone goes dark, and it stays dark. His head stopped moving. How do you know that? She thought about how much to say and decided on the minimum necessary. Because the people who arranged this operation arranged it for today specifically. After today, this location becomes inaccessible by any mechanism that includes you and observers or documented aid operations. She kept her voice flat, factual. I can't tell you more than that. I can tell you that if you complete the distribution in the next 45 minutes, I will have eyes on your perimeter for the entirety of that time. A long silence. She watched him look at his wounded man again, look at the building, look at the radiation monitor in his hand. Then he looked up, scanning the buildings above the courtyard, not finding her, not expecting to. Continue distribution, he said. She watched the aid workers begin moving again, emerging from behind cover in twos, methodical and practiced. She kept her eyes moving across the courtyard's approaches. She noted that the fourth attacker had still not reappeared. She kept that notation in a separate corner of her awareness, flagged and unresolved, the way you kept track of the enemy element you hadn't accounted for. Below, in the eastern wing entrance, the child with the foil blanket watched a medic set up a distribution table. The radio came back at 1214. Not clean, still fragmented, still fighting the interference that had been degrading the signal since 0902, but enough. Callahan's voice arrived in broken pieces, the words separated by bursts of static that swallowed syllables and whole phrases, and she assembled what she could the way she assembled fragmented intelligence, taking the confirmed elements, the words she'd heard clearly, and constructing the most probable meaning from the gaps. Found the paper trail. NAMRS-7 wasn't fully decom. Storage manifests show. Weapons grade. They've been extracting since. Say again, slowly. A pause. The interference surged, peaked, then dropped back to a level that was annoying rather than impenetrable. NAMRS-7. His voice had something under it that she rarely heard. Not alarm, Callahan didn't alarm. Something closer to the quiet, controlled urgency of a man who has found something he wished he hadn't found and is now working through the implications. The decommissioning was incomplete. The public record shows full decommission in 2021. The classified record, which I am not supposed to have access to and which I will deny ever seeing, shows they retained approximately 40 metric tons of weapons-usable radiological material in the primary storage vault, listed as pending regulatory disposition. She processed that. Pending regulatory disposition was the language bureaucracies use when they had a problem they hadn't solved and didn't want to solve today. Put it in the queue, flag it for review, schedule a working group. In the world of weapons-grade radiological material, pending regulatory disposition meant that 40 metric tons of material that could, in the wrong hands or in the wrong configuration, constitute an extraordinary threat to an extraordinary number of people, was sitting in a vault in a decommissioned facility in a radioactive exclusion zone with a partially collapsed perimeter fence and compromised access controls. And someone had known it was there. And someone had decided that today was the day to move it. The contractor team, she said, corporate security for a private defense materials company. Satellite data got corrupted before I could pull the full corporate ID, but the contract vehicle traces through 3 shell companies. A pause while he works something on his end. The shells connect to a parent corporation with active DoD supply relationships. Government contractor, cleared personnel, the kind of organization that moves materials under classified contract and whose paperwork, when it exists at all, is reviewed by people who are also employed by the organization or its subsidiaries. She understood what he was describing, the institutional architecture of plausible deniability. You didn't need to corrupt the oversight process if you had absorbed it. They have cover from inside, she said. Enough cover to make this disappear. The material enters the classified supply chain with a provenance story that traces to a legitimate regulatory disposition. Nobody asks questions they already know the answers to. He paused. Maya, these people didn't plan this for last week. This has been in motion for months. The exclusion zone's monitoring reduction, the satellite overflight gap in this grid, the humanitarian mission being routed to this specific delivery point, these aren't coincidences. Someone with planning authority and institutional access built the conditions for today. She let that settle. And the people who know about it? His voice was careful now, the care of a man saying something he'd rather not say. The clean outcome from their perspective is that today doesn't exist in the record. Humanitarian convoy entered the zone, encountered residual threat activity, probably attributed to salvage criminals or unstable former facility personnel, and a tragic incident occurred. Zone gets reclassified, facility gets remediated under classified contract. The radiological material has already been documented out of existence in the public record. Its movement today generates no new traceable paper. She looked at the Eastern Wing building, the child with the foil blanket, the aid workers distributing medicine with the focused calm of people doing the most important work they knew how to do. The UN observer writing in his waterproof notebook, documenting everything with the institutional faith that documentation mattered. Witnesses are a problem, she said. Once the extraction is complete, he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. How long does the extraction take? She heard him calculating. Not guessing. Callahan didn't guess. He was working from the observable data, the size of the team she described, the equipment profile, the vault dimensions he'd pulled from the facility specifications. 40 metric tons with a 6-person team using the container units I'm seeing in the thermal data, 4 hours minimum, 5 if they're careful about contamination protocols, which professional operators at this cost level will be. He paused. How long have they been inside? She checked her watch, calculated back. Approximately 3 hours. Another pause. 1 to 2 hours remaining. She felt the math of the situation becoming specific, not abstract urgency, but a concrete timeline with an endpoint. 1 to 2 hours until the extraction was complete. 1 to 2 hours until the cost-benefit calculation for the people running this operation shifted from maintain cover to eliminate exposure. I need your satellite feedback, she said. Working on it. The ECM source is inside the facility. They brought dedicated jamming equipment, which tells you how thoroughly they planned this. I'm scanning for frequency gaps they didn't close. There will be at least one. There always is. A pause with a different quality. The quality of a man who has something important to say and is choosing how to say it. Maya, I'm here. Whatever happens in the next 2 hours, the mission doesn't change. You protect those people. Not the intelligence value, not the paper trail, those people. I know. I mean it specifically. The material in that vault is important. The cover story unraveling is important. The institutional accountability question is important. Those things matter. He stopped. They don't matter more than the 43 people in that building. Callahan, she kept her voice even. I know. She heard him exhale. All right, he said. Stay on the line. I'll keep trying. Lazarus announced himself at 1241. Not with a shot, with something more sophisticated than a shot. A section of broken concrete, half a brick's worth of material, loose from the eastern cooling tower's compromised shelf, fell away from the edge, tumbling down the tower's exterior in a series of impacts that produced a sound she could hear clearly across 900 meters of still post-storm air. Accident? Possibly. The tower was structurally compromised. Debris fell. She watched the shelf, watched the shadow patterns across its irregular surface, watched the dust that the debris' departure had disturbed, the way it settled back differently in the absence of what had been there. 3 minutes later, a bird, a desert raptor of some kind, a hawk or a large falcon, launched itself from behind the tower's eastern face and circled twice in a tight pattern before heading south. Disturbed from a perch, moving away from something that had changed in its immediate environment. Not an accident. She understood the game immediately, the way you understood a language you'd studied for years when you finally heard it spoken by a native. He was running stimuli, creating environmental events that would trigger involuntary micro-responses in a positioned shooter. A shooter behind a rifle, watching a specific area with high attention, would react to sudden movement at the edge of their field, not by moving the rifle necessarily, not by doing anything large and visible, but by micro-adjusting. A fractional tension change in the shoulders, a slight shift in the support elbow, a refocus of visual attention. At 900 meters, none of those micro-adjustments were visible to the naked eye. But through a thermal scope, heat signature changes were visible. Through a spotting scope with good optics, dust displacement caused by micro-movement was visible. He was watching through thermals or a high-quality spotting scope, probably both. He was trying to read her the way she was trying to read him. She became very still. Not trained stillness. Trained stillness had its own signature, the micro-tension pattern of active suppression, the specific heat distribution of a body holding itself deliberately rather than resting naturally. She'd learned to recognize it in herself before she'd learned to eliminate it. Callahan had identified it in her third week of counter-sniper training and had made her practice for 6 hours straight until the suppression pattern disappeared and something else emerged in its place. "Stop trying to not move," he'd said. "Move into the stillness." There's a difference. She moved into it now. She let the environment happen around her rather than against it. The wind that occasionally stirred dust in the room, the distant sound of aid workers below, the Geiger counter's rhythm, which she'd stopped consciously hearing 2 hours ago, and which now registered as something closer to ambient, the room's own heartbeat, independent of her. She let all of it become background. She watched the shelf. At 12:47, a section of rebar vibrated. Wind-driven rebar vibrated in resonance with the gusting pattern. All connected sections moving together in the same frequency range. The movement distributed evenly. This vibration was isolated. A single section, third from the left edge, oscillating at a frequency that didn't match the current wind and didn't propagate to adjacent sections. Weight transfer. Someone shifting their footing on a surface where their boots were in contact with that specific rebar section. There. Not center shelf. Left side, behind the largest intact section of concrete remaining on that face of the tower. The concrete section was substantial, 2 meters wide, maybe 1.5 meters of remaining thickness, enough to provide meaningful cover against incoming fire from the south and southwest. He'd placed himself to defeat her original position. The shots she'd taken from the stairwell landing, the angles he'd been able to infer from the suppressive fire during the convoy attack, he'd profiled her as a south-facing shooter and built his cover accordingly. She was northeast of him now. His cover was facing the wrong direction. The shot was 940 meters. Wind post-storm was settling. She was reading 12 to 15 knots from the northwest, decreasing. The angle was difficult but solvable. She had position advantage. She had angle advantage. The rebar vibration had given her a 6-inch square of probability on where his center mass would be relative to that concrete section's edge. She did not take it. She thought through why, systematically, the way Callahan had taught her to think through target decisions that carried consequences beyond the immediate tactical outcome. If she killed Lazarus now, she removed the Overwatch threat. She solved the sniper versus sniper problem, which was the problem that currently dominated her tactical situation and her attention. But the contractor team inside the facility had their own communications, and those communications would include a protocol for loss of Overwatch. The moment Lazarus went silent, no check-in, no all clear, no confirmation that the perimeter was held, the team inside would recognize that something had changed. They would accelerate the extraction, or they would trigger a contingency. And a contingency for a 6-person contractor team with pre-positioned demolition equipment in the vicinity. She didn't know what form that contingency took, but she knew that professional operations at this level built contingencies that were proportional to the stakes. The stakes were very high. She needed Lazarus alive and in position until she understood what the contingency looked like and what she could do to defeat it. She filed the position with the precision of a detail she intended to use later. Settled back into the stillness, watched, waited. Callahan's signal died at 1309. Not degraded, not further jammed, cut. There was a specific difference between a jammed signal and a dead one, and she recognized it immediately. A jammed signal maintained carrier tone, the background hiss of an occupied frequency, interference layered on top of communication, both things present simultaneously. You could still hear the carrier. You knew the equipment was running, the operator was there, the connection existed in a degraded form. A cut signal produced absence. The carrier tone stopped. The frequency went clean in a way that wasn't silence so much as removal. One moment, Callahan's voice had been working through partial sentences about the ECM source location, something about a secondary frequency gap he thought he'd found. The next moment, there was nothing. Not silence exactly, the nothing that meant the specific someone who had been there was no longer there. She keyed the emergency channel. Nothing. She keyed the backup frequency. Nothing. She tried the satellite phone again. No network. The jamming was comprehensive enough to block satellite communication as well, which meant the ECM equipment in the facility was more capable than she'd assumed. Military grade. The kind of system that didn't come from a commercial vendor. She tried the convoy commander's frequency, which was lower band civilian infrastructure that the ECM apparently hadn't been configured to suppress. Either an oversight or a deliberate choice. Suppressing the convoy's comms would have raised questions if anyone outside was monitoring, and the operation's design apparently prioritized invisibility over comprehensiveness. The convoy commander came through clearly. Overwatch, we're seeing a vehicle approach from the north. Single vehicle, moving fast. Copy. Type? Can't tell yet. Something large, moving on the facility's internal road. She repositioned immediately. The northern approach required her to move to a room on the tower's opposite face. A 40-second move she executed without thinking, the layout of the floor memorized hours ago. She settled at the north window. At 13:15, the vehicle resolved through her scope. A heavy utility vehicle, matte black, no markings. Moving at approximately 60 kilometers per hour on the facility's internal access road, the road that connected the northern perimeter to the main complex, the road that her building plans designated as internal operations only, with a gate at the exclusion zone's northern fence line. A gate that was supposed to be sealed. The vehicle had come through a gate that was supposed to be sealed. She tracked it to the north entrance. 2 men exited. Not the same profile as the contractor team she'd watched enter the main facility. These were larger, more heavily equipped, moving with the specific functional efficiency of people who had done this particular type of work many times before. They went to the facility entrance. Brief exchange with someone inside. Access granted. They began unloading equipment from the vehicle's cargo area. She watched the cases carefully. Size, shape, weight distribution as they lifted them. The way a case moved told you something about its content. Too heavy for its size meant dense material, solid payload. These cases were the right size for what she thought they were and moved with the right weight. She'd seen cases that shape in 2 armories and 1 EOD staging area. The shape was specific, distinctive. The configuration of external handles and corner reinforcement, the specific closure mechanism profile, was not ambiguous. Demolition charges, pre-configured, ready to deploy. She sat with that for a moment. They weren't just extracting the material from the primary vault. They were collapsing the vault behind them. She understood the logic. The vault's existence, empty, structurally intact, with recent evidence of access and extraction activity, would raise questions under any subsequent investigation. A vault that had collapsed due to the existing structural instability of a decommissioned facility in a radioactive exclusion zone was not a vault that raised questions. Buildings in degraded environments collapsed. It happened. The remediation contract would note the collapse as a factor requiring additional decontamination work and would proceed accordingly. The material would be gone. The evidence of the material's existence would be gone. The operation would be invisible in the record. Except 43 people in the eastern wing, 200 meters from the primary storage vault. She'd done enough demolition training to understand proximity effects. A directed charge operation focused on a specific structural element, a primary vault, 3-inch steel doors and reinforced concrete, generated vibration patterns that propagated through connected building elements and ground transmission. Focused demolition was not precision demolition. Not at this scale. She keyed the convoy frequency. Convoy lead, get your people deeper into the eastern wing, away from the exterior wall facing the main facility. Now, don't explain why, just move them. A pause. Overwatch. Move them, fast. I will explain when I can. She heard him begin issuing instructions. She heard the sound of people moving, the elevated tone of a commander who was following an instruction he didn't fully understand because the voice giving it had been right before. She looked at the north entrance. She looked at the eastern cooling tower where Lazarus was waiting. She looked at the facility's primary building and began calculating what she had and what she was going to need. The choice resolved itself at 1,341. She'd been running scenarios continuously since she'd identified the demolition equipment, holding each one up against the available facts and discarding it when it failed to account for all of them. Not the facts she wanted, the facts as they existed. The enemy positions she knew versus the ones she suspected. The timeline she could confirm versus the ones she was estimating. The capabilities she had and the ones she didn't. Every scenario converged on the same two options. Not because she'd missed something. She'd checked that twice. Because the geometry of the situation genuinely reduced to 2 targets and 2 outcomes, and the space between them was the decision she was going to have to make. Option 1, Lazarus, Eastern Cooling Tower, left side of the compromised shelf, 940 meters. She had angle, northeast defeating his south-facing cover. She had wind, post-storm 12 to 15 knots from the northwest, steady, predictable, within the correction envelope she'd been working all day. The shot was at the outer edge of her reliable engagement range, but within her demonstrated capability. She'd shot 940 meters clean in qualification, twice in field conditions. Killing Lazarus removed the Overwatch threat. Without Overwatch, the contractor team's communications protocol changed. Without the sniper controlling the perimeter, the operation became vulnerable to external response once the emergency monitoring registered the demolition event. More immediately, without Lazarus covering the perimeter, the convoy had a withdrawal window. If she took the shot now and immediately signaled the convoy commander to move, they might be able to clear the blast radius before the demolition team finished their preparation. Might. The operative variable she couldn't resolve. Option 2, the vent control tower. She'd reread the facility technical specifications twice since 1300, working through the engineering descriptions with the specific attention of someone who needed to find something that might not be there. The vent control tower, a 40-meter structure between the main facility building and the cooling towers, controlling the radiation management systems for the entire complex, had a mechanical emergency override protocol built into its original design. The designers of NAMRS-7 had been thinking about catastrophic failure scenarios when they built this facility. They'd built in a mechanical last resort. If the control tower's primary support column experienced structural failure beyond a specified threshold, a vibration sensor in the foundation plate would trigger an automated emergency sequence. radiation vents to full capacity, cooling system to emergency maximum, and, most critically, the facility's own emergency alarm and monitoring system would activate on frequencies that existed outside the standard communication bands. Frequencies that weren't being jammed because they connected to federal emergency infrastructure, and suppressing them would have required the demolition team to compromise federal monitoring systems, which was a step further than they'd apparently been willing to go. If the emergency protocol activated, the facility would announce itself to every monitoring station in its network. The cover story would have a hole in it. The operations timeline would compress to minutes rather than the hour or two remaining in the extraction schedule. The demolition team would abort. They'd have no choice. Their operational security depended on invisibility, and invisible operations didn't generate federal emergency responses. The storage vault would remain sealed. The material wouldn't move today. The contamination plume that she was thinking about in the back of her mind, that she'd been avoiding thinking about directly since Callahan's last transmission, would not be triggered. She needed to hit the vent tower's primary support column at the junction weld, 1.4 meters above the foundation plate. One shot, specific point of impact, 620 meters from her current position at the best available angle. But the angle required her to be visible from the eastern cooling tower, from Lazarus. She would be exposed for a minimum of 8 seconds while acquiring and breaking the shot. 8 seconds was a long time when the other person was very good. She looked at the eastern tower. She looked at the vent control structure. She looked at the building where 43 people were sheltering, where the distribution was still ongoing, where the UN observer was still writing in his notebook, where someone had given a child a foil emergency blanket and the child was still wearing it. She made her choice. The fragment of Callahan's last transmission had been 3 words she could confirm and a number she'd dismissed. She hadn't dismissed the words. She'd filed them in the category of things she couldn't act on yet because she didn't have enough context. Cooling system was 2 of the 3 confirmed words. The third was a number that she'd taken as a frequency designation, some value he'd found in his scan for a gap in the ECM coverage. It wasn't a frequency. She pulled the facility technical specifications from her kit. Printed copy, spiral bound, 41 pages. Callahan had insisted on printed backups for everything. Electronics fail, he'd said. Paper doesn't lose signal. She thought it was old man paranoia until precisely this moment. She went to the section on the cooling system. Not the emergency override, which she'd already read. The incident documentation. The technical account of what had happened in 2019. The number Callahan had said was not a frequency. It was a pressure value, a specific measurement from the original incident report describing the residual pressure state in the underground storage matrix at the time of the emergency patch implementation. She read the technical description carefully. The 2019 event had not been a simple release. She'd understood it as a contained incident, a controlled failure, messy but bounded, resulting in the contamination footprint that defined the exclusion zone. That was the public description. That was what the briefing had characterized it as. The technical specifications described something different in the language of engineering. The facility's primary cooling mechanism had experienced a cascade failure that had been arrested before it reached its terminal phase. Arrested by an emergency patch, a physical intervention in the cooling system's pressure management that had stabilized the situation by creating an active counterpressure in the underground storage matrix. The patch was still active. 5 years later, the emergency patch was still actively functioning, maintaining the pressure balance that the original cascade failure had disrupted. Nobody had formally decommissioned it because formally decommissioning it required acknowledging that the original incident had been more serious than the public record described, and acknowledging that opened questions about the facility's operational history that the responsible parties had apparently preferred not to open. If the pressure balance in the underground storage matrix was disrupted, If the cooling system experienced another cascade failure, triggered by, for example, the structural vibration produced by large-scale demolition charges detonated in and around the primary storage vault, the emergency patch's counterpressure would collapse. The pressure differential would reverse. The stored material would heat. Not to explosive levels. Radiological material didn't combust. It didn't detonate. But at sufficient thermal levels, in a compromised containment environment with a partially collapsed facility structure providing inadequate shielding, the material would off-gas. It would aerosolize. It would enter the air column as fine particulate contamination of a quality and quantity that the exclusion zone had never seen. 40 metric tons, aerosolized, wind from the northwest at 12 knots. She checked the wind indicator below her window, the cloth she'd hung on a piece of rebar, moving steadily toward the northeast. She checked the topographic map in the briefing packet, the populated areas at the exclusion zone's edge, the towns that had been resettled after the original evacuation, declared safe based on the monitored contamination levels that had stabilized over 5 years. Those contamination levels had stabilized because the pressure balance had held. She traced the wind line northeast from the exclusion zone's boundary. 300,000 people. The demolition team was not trying to destroy evidence. They were, through either catastrophic incompetence or deliberate intent, and she could not determine which was worse, preparing to trigger the largest radiological contamination event in American history. She stared at the vent control tower for a long moment. The emergency protocol activated before the demolition charges detonated meant the cooling system stabilized, pressure differential equalized, dispersal risk at zero, and the operation announced itself to the monitoring network. The emergency protocol activated after the demolition charges meant none of that happened. She looked at the eastern tower. 8 seconds. She began planning the sequence. She moved at 1,347. The route from her current position to the shot angle for the vent tower required her to cross 40 meters of exposed rooftop. The residential tower's flat roof, accessible through the stairwell hatch she'd mapped during her initial sweep of the building. 40 meters of open ground, no meaningful cover except the HVAC equipment clusters scattered across the surface at irregular intervals. Sheet metal housings, compressor units, the skeletal remains of a satellite dish array that had been stripped of its dishes but left its mounting hardware. None of it was cover against a precision rifle at 900 meters. She ran the Lazarus problem one final time. His confirmed position, left side of the eastern cooling tower's compromised shelf, cover facing south, defeating her original stairwell angle. He did not know she'd repositioned since the convoy attack. The shots she'd taken from the stairwell landing were the last data he had on her location. He'd built his position to defeat that angle. From the northeast, where she was now, his cover was pointing the wrong direction. If she moved to the rooftop, she'd be north of his last known fix on her. The angle shift was approximately 40 degrees. For him to reacquire, he'd need to detect her movement, identify her new position, rearrange. The rooftop parapet versus the stairwell opening changed the elevation calculation, and rerun his wind correction. Post-storm wind had shifted. His existing firing solution was stale. Even for a shooter of his caliber, that full reacquisition sequence took 4 to 6 seconds minimum. She had 8 seconds of exposure. 4 to 6 second response window against 8 seconds of exposure. 2 to 4 second margin. She'd worked with worse margins. Once, in a collapsed building in Mosul, she'd had a 1.8 second window, and she'd used it. Callahan had debriefed her on it for 2 hours afterward, not because she'd made the wrong call, but because he wanted to understand exactly what she'd been thinking in the moment she decided to take it. "What were you thinking?" he'd asked. "I was thinking about the family in the room behind me," she'd said. He'd nodded once, written something in his notebook, never mentioned it again. She reached the stairwell hatch at 1349. She listened for 30 seconds. The post-storm air was quieter now. The wind had dropped further. She could hear her own breathing inside the MOPP suit's partial hood configuration. She could hear the distant, muted sound of the convoy commander's voice below, still coordinating the distribution. She could hear the Geiger counter, which she'd stopped consciously registering, but which her peripheral awareness tracked the same way you tracked weather when you spent enough time outside. Still climbing. Now at 1.4 millisieverts per hour. The wind at this elevation was running at 14 to 16 knots from the northwest, steady for the past 7 minutes. Steady wind was the only variable she could fully solve for. She set the correction in her mind, not calculating at this point, but recalling. She'd been running this wind value through her firing solution since the storm passed. She knew the number. It was part of her already. Vent tower primary support column, left face, base section. Junction weld at 1.4 meters above the foundation plate. The weld bead was visible in her scope, slightly raised, darker material than the surrounding column surface, weathered paint that had contracted differently over the years. A target she could see clearly, range from the rooftop's northern edge, approximately 620 meters. Closer than her original calculation because the rooftop's footprint extended her forward of the stairwell position. She needed one shot, one clean break at the junction weld. The vibration sensor in the foundation plate would do the rest. She pushed the hatch open. The desert air arrived immediately, particulate-laden, carrying that specific metallic undertone that she'd been breathing filtered for hours, and which hit differently without the full seal. She had the hood seated. She had the face seal. The taste was psychological, not physical. She told herself that. She moved low across the rooftop surface, using the HVAC clusters as partial concealment, while accepting that from certain angles, from the eastern tower's position specifically, she was visible between them. There was no clean route. There was only the fast route and the slow route, and the slow route cost time she didn't have. She moved fast. She reached the rooftop's northern edge at 1351. Set up prone behind the low parapet, 6 inches of aging masonry, enough to matter against a shot that was slightly off, not enough to matter against a shot that was on. She wasn't relying on the parapet for protection. She was relying on speed. She found the vent tower through the scope, support column, left face. The junction weld, exactly where the specifications had shown it, clear, defined, 620 meters. She began the trigger sequence, breath, settle, pressure. The round hit the parapet 2 inches from her left hand. She felt it before she heard it. The impact transmitted through the masonry into the surface under her elbows. A sharp, concussive thud that arrived slightly before the flat crack of the supersonic round. He'd been on her before she'd settled. Faster than 4 to 6 seconds. He'd been watching the stairwell hatch. He'd anticipated the rooftop. She rolled right, hard, 3 meters before she came up behind the largest HVAC unit on the northern section of the roof. A compressor housing about 1.5 meters tall, sheet metal over a steel frame. Not rated for direct fire, rated for deflection and concealment, which was what she needed in the next 30 seconds while she rebuilt her options. She lay still and thought with the specific speed of someone who doesn't have time to think slowly. He'd read her. Not guessed, read. He'd anticipated the rooftop move and had been positioned for it before she pushed the hatch. Which meant either he'd been watching the hatch since she first went inside the building, tracking her potential movement options, or he'd analyzed her tactical situation the same way she'd been analyzing his, and arrived at the same conclusion about what she'd have to do. The second option was more likely and more uncomfortable. She could not acquire the vent tower from behind the HVAC unit. The unit's mass blocked the angle entirely. If she moved to reacquire, she'd be back in the open, and he'd already demonstrated he could put a round on her position within 2 seconds of her appearing. He wouldn't miss twice from the same setup. She needed him to move. Or she needed him to commit so hard to a specific line that she could work around it. Lazarus was patient. Soviet doctrine held position, waited for the target to expose. He would not leave the eastern tower to chase her across the rooftop. He would wait for her to come back into his line of fire, and he would have that line covered, and his breathing controlled, and his firing solution current. She needed to give him a line of fire that wasn't her. She went through her kit. The shooting bag, small, sand-filled, the size her palm when compressed, but expandable to approximately the size of a human head when she manipulated the fill distribution. She adjusted it, took her boonie hat and placed it over the bag, settling it at an angle that suggested a shooter's head at low-profile position. It would not fool a good observer for more than a fraction of a second. It didn't need to. She extended the combination around the left side of the HVAC unit, low, at the level of the parapet's top edge. The angle was wrong for an actual shooting position, too low, wrong geometry. But from 900 meters, in the moment of apparent movement, it would register as a target before it resolved as a decoy. She moved right at the same moment she extended the decoy left. The round came in 0.6 seconds. The bag and hat ceased to exist as coherent objects. But in the 0.4 seconds she had the scope up while completing her roll to the right, she'd had the scope up, she'd been looking, she'd been waiting for the muzzle flash. She saw it. Western cooling tower, not the eastern tower. He'd relocated during the radiation storm. He'd been on the western tower the entire time since the front passed, and she'd been profiling him on the eastern tower based on the rebar vibration she'd read at 1247. He'd fed her that. The weight transfer on the rebar had been deliberate. He'd given her a false position and let her build her approach around defeating cover that wasn't where she thought it was. She was northeast of where she thought he was. He was north-northwest of her current position. She ran the new geometry. From the rooftop's eastern edge, she had a sight line to the western cooling tower. She also had a sight line to the vent tower. A different angle than she'd originally planned, slightly more oblique, but the junction weld was still accessible. The eastern edge of the rooftop was fully exposed to his position on the western tower. She had his location. He had hers. The geometry had resolved into a single, brutal equation. Whoever moved next was going to be visible, and visible was the same as targeted. The difference was that she was moving to save 43 people and whatever was in the path of a 12-knot northwest wind. He was moving to finish a job that was already over. She had 5 seconds of nerve to find. She got up and ran. Not a bound, not a tactical movement with pauses and covered angles and the careful application of concealment. She ran. Full speed, upright, rifle coming up as she moved, the reticle swinging toward the vent tower as she crossed the rooftop's northern face toward the eastern edge. The round hit the rooftop surface 3 feet behind her left heel, close enough that the impact debris peppered the back of her boot. She dropped prone at the eastern parapet. Hard. No controlled landing. She hit the surface and let the impact absorb, kept the scope on the vent tower, found the support column. 590 meters from this position. She'd covered ground during the run, closer than planned. The junction weld was in the scope. She could see the weld bead, the weathered paint, the specific raised texture of older metalwork on a structure that had been standing in a desert environment for 30 years. She could hear Lazarus working his bolt. The mechanical sound carried in the post-storm stillness. One action, deliberate. He was cycling a spent case and chambering a fresh round. He'd fired at the decoy, fired at her run, and now he was chambering for the shot he intended to make count. She had the time it took him to acquire and settle. She calculated it at 2.5 seconds from the bolt cycle sound. She had the wind, 14 knots northwest, steady. She had the range, 590 meters, confirmed. She had the correction already built in from hours of working this wind value. She had the target, junction weld, 1.4 meters above the foundation plate, weld bead visible in the scope. She had everything she needed. She broke the trigger. The suppressed round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second and covered 590 meters in approximately 0.63 seconds, during which the wind pushed it 4.2 inches to the right of bore center, which she had already accounted for. She was rolling before the impact registered visually, rolling left, away from the firing position, getting the parapet between herself and the western tower, coming to rest against the base of the parapet with the rifle pulled in against her body. The round from Lazarus hit the parapet's top edge where her head had been. The concrete fragmented. Pieces of it hit her sleeve hard enough that she'd find bruising there later. The main fragment, the size of a fist, passed close enough that she felt displaced air through the MOPP suit's face seal. Close. She lay still against the parapet base and listened. The wind, the Geiger counter, and then, from 620 meters away, the sound she'd been calculating toward for the past hour, the deep, metallic groan of a steel structure under stress exceeding its design tolerance. A single sharp crack, the fracture propagating through the weld's heat-affected zone, the weakest point in any welded joint. And then the pneumatic exhalation of a system releasing pressure it had been containing since 2019. 5 years of held breath. The emergency protocol activated. The alarms came first. She'd heard the facility's radiation alarm at the beginning of all this. A single unit, the one nearest the access road, screaming across the exclusion zone when the day started. That sound multiplied now into something that was less alarm and more environment. Every unit on the facility's exterior activated in the same automated sequence, overlapping in the slightly offset timing of a distributed system coming online, until the individual alarms merged into a continuous wall of sound that crossed the desert in all directions and didn't diminish with distance the way normal sound did. It was designed to be heard. It was heard. The automated systems followed the alarms with the logic of a facility that had been designed for exactly this scenario. She heard the vault lockdown sequence from inside the primary building, a sound she recognized from the facility specifications as the hydraulic engagement of the emergency barrier doors. 3-inch steel panels driven into their frames by pressure that was designed to be irreversible without manual override codes. The codes that the contractor team carried. The codes were now on the wrong side of a sealed door. She raised herself enough to see over the parapet's broken edge. Not high, just enough for scope clearance. The north entrance, the demolition team. One of them was at the facility door, pressing his hands against it in the specific gesture of someone whose access has just been denied. Pushing. The door was 3 inches of hydraulic lock steel. He was pushing against it the way people pushed against things that had already been decided. He pulled out a radio and spoke into it urgently. The door did not open. Inside the main facility building, through the ground floor windows, she could see movement. Purposeful, accelerated movement. People heading for exits with the specific controlled urgency of professionals who had run abort scenarios and knew what abort looked like. The contractor team was extracting, not in panic, in the organized withdrawal of an operation that had hit its contingency threshold. The demolition team at the north entrance reached their own threshold 30 seconds later. She watched the team leader make the call. She could read it in his posture, the specific moment of decision visible even at this distance. He said something to his partner. His partner began loading the undeployed charge cases back into the utility vehicle, each case handled with the careful speed of someone who understood that the contents required respect, even in a hurry. They had the cases loaded in 4 minutes. The vehicle moved north. Fast. The decision of professionals who understood that an activated federal emergency monitoring system had a response timeline, and that timeline was now running. and their anonymity was measured in how much of that timeline they could put between themselves and this location before the response assets arrived. She tracked the vehicle until it disappeared beyond the facility's northern perimeter. The facility was effectively empty. She allowed herself 4 seconds of stillness. Not celebration, not relief. The specific 4 seconds of cessation that came after an extended period of operating at maximum cognitive load, when the immediate threat had been resolved and the follow-on threats hadn't yet crystallized into actionable problems. 4 seconds. Then she raised the scope toward the western cooling tower. He was still there. She'd half expected him to be gone, mission compromised, professional abort, extract and evade before the monitoring response arrived. A rational calculus. The operation was over. The material was secured behind emergency-locked vault doors. The cover story had a hole in it that was generating a federal response. There was nothing left to protect and everything to lose by staying. But Lazarus hadn't moved. She found him in the scope with the patience of someone who already knew approximately where to look. He was disciplined. His profile was minimized, his position designed to reduce visible signature to the smallest practical footprint. But she'd seen the muzzle flash. She had the angular data from 2 shots. She knew the section of tower he was on, the specific geometry of his cover, the range. She found the slight asymmetry of outline that no training fully eliminated. The way a human form, however well concealed, displaced shadow differently than the concrete and rebar it was nested in. 940 meters. The wind had continued dropping since the storm passed. She read the mirage through the scope, the heat shimmer off the desert surface, its lean and frequency telling her wind value more accurately than any instrument at this range. 8 to 10 knots now, northwest, decreasing. The cloth indicator below her showed minimal movement, consistent with the mirage read. She corrected for the drop, corrected for the wind, corrected for the Coriolis effect at this latitude in this range, a fraction of a milliradian that only mattered if everything else was perfect, and she intended everything else to be perfect. Why was he still here? She thought about it the way you thought about problems while your hands were doing something else. Her hands were managing the rifle. Her breathing was settling into the pre-shot rhythm. Her eye was on the scope, and the question moved through the back of her mind with the persistence of something that mattered. He was a professional. He'd watched the alarms activate. He'd watched the demolition team load their cases and leave. He'd watched the contractor team extract from the facility. He was experienced enough to understand that a federal emergency monitoring response was already in motion, and that the window for clean extraction was closing in real time. He was still here because she was still here. That was the only answer that fit. A professional sniper at the end of a compromised operation, staying on station for one reason: to ensure that the person who had seen what happened today didn't leave the exclusion zone with the ability to describe it. Not because it would change anything. The operation was already compromised, but because professionals finish their assignments, and his assignment included her. She understood that. She didn't resent it. She broke the trigger at the bottom of an exhale, in the stillness between one heartbeat and the next, in the place that Callahan had called the space between thinking and doing, and that she had learned over 14 months of working with him was not a metaphor, but a physical reality that existed for approximately 0.3 seconds if you prepared for it correctly. The round traveled 940 meters in 1.28 seconds. During those 1.28 seconds, she held the scope steady on his position, watching. The asymmetry of outline changed, not dramatically, not the way it changed in films, with motion and impact and the visible physics of force applied to mass. It changed the way things changed when the internal organization that had been maintaining them ceased to function. A settling. A different quality of stillness replacing the active stillness of a living person in a held position. She waited 90 seconds. The outline didn't move. She lowered the scope. The western cooling tower stood against a pale, late-afternoon sky. Concrete cylinder, ragged upper edge where years of minor seismic activity and weather had worked at the structure. An industrial artifact that had outlasted the industry it served. In 6 months, the desert would have reclaimed whatever evidence remained on that tower. The wind and the particulate would work at it. The sun would bleach it. The exclusion zone would continue doing what exclusion zones did, preserving the silence of a place that had been removed from ordinary time, as if nothing had happened here. She found she had nothing particular to think about that. She raised the scope one more time and checked the courtyard systematically. The convoy vehicles, the eastern wing entrance, the approaches, the perimeter. Clear. She checked the northern access road. Clear. She checked the cooling towers, both of them, methodically, the discipline of not assuming what she wanted to be true. Clear. She lowered the rifle. The Geiger counter ticked. The helicopters came in from the south at 1512, 2 of them running low and fast over the exclusion zone's perimeter, the rotor sound arriving before the visual. Not the light insertion bird that had brought her in. These were heavier, the medevac configuration she associated with mass casualty response protocols. Someone had filed paperwork describing this as a medical evacuation, which meant someone outside the zone had been monitoring the emergency system activation and had made a determination about what type of response was appropriate. She noted without surprise that neither helicopter bore the unit markings she would have expected from her own operational command. She came down from the tower the same way she'd gone up, stairwell, lobby, out through the rear exit, moving along the building's shadow line to the courtyard. She hadn't stopped to change anything or clean anything. The MOPP suit had taken significant abuse. The sleeve had concrete fragment damage. Her left knee ached from a landing she'd made too hard during the rooftop sequence. She was functional. That was the threshold that mattered. The convoy commander was standing in the courtyard when she came around the building's corner. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had been through something he didn't fully understand and had the professional discipline not to ask about it out loud. He looked at the rifle, the MOPP suit damage, the way she was moving. He made his decision not to ask questions. 43, he said. She stopped. 43 what? All 43. We completed distribution before the lockdown sealed interior access. He looked at his notebook. He'd been writing in it throughout. Not the UN observer's documentary instinct, his own operational record-keeping. Antibiotics, antivirals, radiation sickness treatment protocol, full course per individual, water purification materials, 2 weeks of caloric supplement. He looked up. Documentation complete. She looked at the eastern wing entrance. The door was open. The emergency lockdown had released when the system stabilized, as the specifications said it would. The automated systems had done their job. Inside, she could see the aid workers still moving, unhurried now, the specific productive calm of a team that had completed the critical phase of an operation and was working through the secondary tasks. And in the near corner of the outer room, not against the wall anymore, standing, the child with the foil blanket around her shoulders was standing at the edge of the activity, watching an aid worker pack a medical kit with the full focused attention of a child who has decided that whatever is happening is something worth watching closely. The blanket caught the afternoon light through the entrance, silver gold. Maya looked at her for a moment. The helicopter rotors were loud overhead, and the Geiger counter was still ticking, and there were no words for what the past 8 hours had contained, or what it meant that 43 people in a building 200 meters from a demolition team had received their medicine. She turned away. She began breaking down her position, unloading the rifle, clearing the chamber, running through the sequence that Callahan had drilled into her until it was as automatic as breathing. You always cleared the weapon when the operation was over. You always broke down the hide. You always left the position as you found it. Old habits, good ones. The helicopters landed in the courtyard. The debrief was conducted 2 days later. The facility was unremarkable. A conference room in a building she'd been transported to by vehicle, with blacked-out windows, which told her the location was something she wasn't cleared to know, or something someone wanted her not to know. And she'd stopped distinguishing between those two categories a long time ago. 4 people across the table, no names offered, civilian clothes on all of them. The specific quality of civilian clothes worn by people who wore uniforms most of the time. The conference room had no visible recording equipment, which meant the recording equipment was not visible. She gave her account. She described the convoy protection operation. The hostile contact at 1108, 4-person element, direct action profile, neutralized. The emergency activation of the facility's safety systems at 1403, triggered by her assessment of an imminent structural threat in proximity to the civilian population. The sniper engagement, 1 hostile shooter at range, threat neutralized at 1405. The convoy distribution, completed in full, 43 individuals processed, documentation with the convoy commander. She did not describe the contractor team's entry into the facility or their equipment configuration. She did not describe the contents of the primary storage vault or the technical specifications she'd read from the printed backup in her kit. She did not describe the demolition equipment or the utility vehicle or the north gate that had been opened by someone with access authority. She did not describe what she understood about the pressure balance in the underground storage matrix and what the demolition charges would have done to it. She described a sniper engagement in a hazardous environment with outcomes consistent with her mission parameters. The woman across from her, mid-40s, the flat competence of someone who had conducted many debriefs and had learned to read what wasn't being said as carefully as what was, looked at her report for a long time without speaking. "This document," she finally said, "describes a routine convoy defense operation." Yes. Hostile contact by parties unknown, consistent with documented threat activity in the exclusion zone. That's accurate. Emergency system activation attributed to structural instability. Automated response. That's the most technically accurate description of the activation mechanism, Maya said. The woman looked up from the report, the specific look of someone who was deciding how much of what they understood to put into the room. "Sergeant Carter, is there anything you wish to add to this report?" Maya thought about 43 people, about a child standing up, about a contamination plume on a 12-knot northwest wind, and 300,000 people who had gone about their day without knowing that someone in a radioactive exclusion zone had made a calculation on their behalf. "No," she said, "the report is complete." The woman held her eyes for a moment longer than a routine confirmation required. Then she nodded once. "Close the folder." "Dismissed." Maya stood, picked up her copy of the report, walked to the door. She didn't look back. The call came at 0200, 4 days after the debrief. She was in her bunk, not sleeping. The billet ceiling had acoustic tiles arranged in a pattern she had by now memorized completely. 847 individual tiles, accounting for the partial tiles at the edges. She'd counted them in the first night and recounted them in the second to confirm the number. A habit she'd developed in field environments where sleeping wasn't an option and the mind needed something to do that wasn't process. The emergency satellite phone buzzed twice on the footlocker. She'd kept it in violation of turn-in protocols, and she'd known she was keeping it in violation of turn-in protocols. And she'd kept it anyway. She picked it up. "You alive?" Callahan's voice, flat, unhurried, the voice that had never changed pitch in a sandstorm or a mortar barrage, or during the 14 months she'd worked with him through conditions that had changed other people's voices permanently. She closed her eyes. "I'm alive." "Good." A pause. Not his thinking pause or his calculating pause. Just the pause of someone who had needed to ask the question and had received the answer and was sitting with it for a moment. I'm in a hospital in Nevada. They hit the comm station with a directed power surge, took out the equipment and knocked me down. Some burns on my hands and forearm. Nothing structural. I'll be out in a week, maybe less. Callahan, don't. Firm, not unkind. The tone of someone who had already decided how this part of the conversation was going to go. Don't do the accountability thing. What happened to my station happened because people with more resources and more institutional access than either of us decided what was worth protecting today. That's not your failure to carry. She was quiet. The report, he said, routine convoy defense. She heard him exhale. The sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Of course. A pause. Did they complete the extraction? No. Lockdown sealed before they finished. Material is still in the vault. Still in NAM-RS-7. Yes, behind 3-inch hydraulic doors. I assume someone in the regulatory structure is currently trying to explain how a routine remediation contract produced a federal emergency monitoring event. They'll manage it, he said. They're good at managing things. A pause. The 43? Full distribution, all documented. Another silence. This one different from his working silences. She'd learned to distinguish them over 14 months. The silence of someone processing information from the silence of someone sitting with something that didn't require processing. And the girl, he said. She didn't ask how he knew. She'd stopped asking how Callahan knew things he shouldn't have been able to know somewhere around month 3 of working together. She was standing up when the helicopters came, Maya said. Still had the blanket. The silence that followed was the second kind. All right, he said finally. They're going to bury it, she said. All of it. Yes. The UN observer had a full notebook. The convoy commander kept records. The aid workers were professionals with institutional affiliations and documentation habits. Their reports will describe a humanitarian delivery with hostile contact, routine incident, not because they're complicit, because they're experienced enough to understand what their reports need to say to protect the operation's future viability. He paused. The UN observer, especially, he's done this long enough to know that the documented truth and the useful truth aren't always the same document. That doesn't sit right. He was quiet for long enough that she thought about saying his name. What sits right, he said finally, and what's true, those aren't always the same thing either. What's true is that 43 people have medicine they didn't have yesterday. What's true is that 40 metric tons of weapons-usable material is still locked in a vault instead of moving through a classified supply chain to wherever it was going. What's true is that 300,000 people went to sleep tonight in houses that are still there. He stopped. What sits right is a different question. I don't have a good answer for what sits right. She stared at the ceiling tiles. Get some sleep, he said. Callahan. Carter. She didn't have anything to say after his name. She'd said his name because she needed a moment that wasn't the silence or the mission debrief or the thing she was trying to decide whether to put into words. Thank you, she said, for the printed specs. A pause. Old man paranoia, he said. Yes. Sleep. The line went dead. She lay in the dark and listened to a base she'd been on for 4 days and would leave in 2 more. And she thought about the cooling towers standing in the empty desert and the vault locked behind steel doors and the girl with the foil blanket standing up. The orders came 6 days later. New assignment, different zone. The briefing packet was 53 pages. Satellite imagery, intelligence assessments, threat characterization, personnel profiles, communication protocols. She'd need most of a day to read it properly. She sat with it on the footlocker in the late afternoon, the light through the billet window going orange the way desert light went orange at this hour and latitude. She'd grown up in a city where the light did something different at this hour, caught on buildings and glass, fractured, urban. She'd learned desert light in training and had been operating in it long enough now that it had become the baseline. The things she read the way she read wind and distance. The sky said, clear. Wind northwest, decreasing. No fronts building. Good conditions for overwatch. She opened the briefing packet to the first page. The satellite phone buzzed. Text message, which Callahan almost never used. He had strong views about text messages and the records they created and the ways those records could be used. She'd heard the views articulated in detail. She agreed with the underlying logic. He'd sent 2 lines. Kid, wars aren't fought in black and white. They're fought in the gray. She read them twice. Set the phone down on the footlocker next to the briefing packet. She looked at the window for a moment. The orange light. The particular quality of desert late afternoon that she'd come to know the way you came to know a language. Not by learning it, but by living in it until it became part of how you thought. She thought about 43 people in a building 200 meters from a demolition team. About a pressure balance in an underground storage matrix that had held for 5 years because nobody had touched it and had nearly not held because someone decided today was the day to touch it. About a contamination plume that didn't exist because she'd been in a position she wasn't supposed to be in, with a rifle she'd been trained to use, making a decision in 2.5 seconds that she'd been preparing to make for 14 months without knowing that was what she was preparing for. She thought about a child with a foil blanket standing up. The people who had built today were still operational, still connected, still insulated by the layered institutional architecture of clearances and contracts and relationships that made them, in any practical accounting, unreachable. The report said routine. The classified record, whatever form it eventually took, would say something that protected the people who needed protecting and obscured the people who needed obscuring. The vault was locked. The material hadn't moved. 300,000 people had gone about their lives without knowing. That was today's accounting. Tomorrow's briefing packet was 53 pages. She picked it up and began to read. The radiation alarms in her memory, the wall of sound that had crossed the desert in all directions when the emergency protocol activated, the sound of a system announcing itself after 5 years of silence, faded into the ambient background of the base. Generators, distant vehicle movement, someone running a perimeter check on the far fence line, the ordinary sounds of a military installation doing its ordinary work. One more mission. The gray went on.